Hi, everyone. I have a few administrative announcements to make before the lecture. Please be quiet. Thank you. The first announcement is that for those of you who have already gone to purchase your books, you will have noticed that there were two that were not in. One is Weiming, Centrality and Commonality. That arrived today, so you can go back and get it any time. The second book is called To Become a Sage by Michael Colton. That will not be in until March 1st, but we're not reading it until April, so no problem. Okay, so there's one book, To Become a Sage, will not be available until the beginning of March. Second announcement is, as Professor Du said last time, there is no lottery for this course. If you would like to take it, please do. Second, the third, we'll be doing the sectioning on Thursday. Okay, we'll be doing sectioning at the beginning of class on Thursday, and section meetings will begin next week. You'll notice that there are a few articles and books that are not for purchase. They are on reserve. They are on reserve in 3 libraries: Lamont, Hillis, and Yenjing Library. Yenjing Library on Divinity Avenue. Also, every lecture is being videotaped. If for some reason you are not able to make it to a lecture, you may see it at the Boylston Language Lab, down in the basement of Boylston Hall. Okay, so all the lectures are being videotaped. Finally, the teaching fellow office for this course is in the core building on the 2nd floor, room 24. The office is room 24 of the core building. If you miss a lecture and you need a handout, any of the handouts for the course, we will have all of the handouts there. That's also where most of the teaching fellows will have their office hours. Thank you.
In 1991, I asked for leave of absence from Harvard University for a year to serve as the director of the Institute of Culture and Communication at the East-West Center in Honolulu. Then the main project I initiated there at the time was Dialogue of Civilizations. The purpose at the time was twofold. First, to explore the possibilities and also the conditions for the possible emergence of a global ethic through intercultural civilizational dialogue. In other words, through the various kinds of inter-civilizational dialogues, we want to see whether there is a possibility of discussing among people of different faith communities the idea of a global ethic. The second one was to probe spiritual resources, particularly of indigenous traditions, for addressing the crisis of the modern world. When we say indigenous traditions, we're talking about Hawaiian spirituality, Native American spirituality, Maori spirituality, and so forth. My own concern was also twofold. First, what can Confucian humanism learn from such a multifaceted dialogue? How can someone who's familiar with the Confucian tradition learn from other religious traditions or spiritual traditions? And the second one is, of course, what are the spiritual resources in the Confucian tradition that can help us to address not only perennial human concerns, but increasingly urgent problems confronting our environment, community, and of course the life world as a whole. Over the years, I've been engaged in a series of Buddhist to Confucian dialogues Christian Confucian dialogues, Jewish Confucian dialogues, Islamic Confucian dialogues, and more recently, Hindu Confucian dialogues. I just came back from a rather extended trip to India. Although I'm realistic enough to appreciate the warning of an inevitable clash of civilizations. You know, one of our most respected colleagues talked about the clash of civilizations since 1993. His argument is that, look toward the 21st century, economic conflicts, political conflicts will continue. But the most difficult conflict to handle is the conflict of clash of civilizations. I'm realistic enough to appreciate that warning. But I'm convinced that through dialogue, communication, the danger of conflict can be reduced, and even authentic possibilities of peaceful coexistence and mutual support, even among major civilizations, can be realized. This is not a dream. This is not an idealistic statement. This is out of a sense of necessity. Precisely because we see the danger of conflict, the need for dialogue becomes even more urgent. At the invitation of the World Conference on Religion and Peace, a non-governmental organization, I presented a statement in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations at UN headquarters in New York City last September. Even though the tone, as you noticed, is a bit high-sounding for our purpose here, the thesis I try to lay out, of course, in a highly condensed form, serves as a background or background understanding for the broad civilizational context in which this particular course, Moral Reasoning 40, Confucian Humanism, is situated. In other words, I want to give this here to give a sense that when I approach this particular subject, I approach it from a very broad civilizational context. In response to, quote, the challenge of contemporary spirituality, which is a meeting, I consider myself a student of Asian and comparative thought and religion, made the following plea. We need an ethic significantly different from the social Darwinian model of self-interest and competitiveness. We must go beyond the mentality that the promise of growth is limitless and the supply of energy is inexhaustible, which is, of course, very clear. The destructiveness of secular humanism. I want to make sure that Confucianism is not misunderstood as a form of secular humanism. The destructiveness of secular humanism lies not in its secularity, in its pursuit of economic interest or political might, but lies in its anthropocentrism. In fact, anthropocentrism, from the Confucian perspective, is both a limitation and inertia. It is not a good description of what we do. The exclusive focus on humanity, on the human situation, as the measure of all things, that man is the measure of all things, as some of the Greek humanists would have it, or as endowed with the unquestioned authority of dominion over nature, relegates the spiritual realm. Of course, we have to define what that realm really means in the Confucian context, to irrelevance, and reduces nature to an object of consumption. Now, we may, of course, gaze at the distant stars, but we are rooted here on earth and have become acutely aware of the vulnerability of the earth, and we even increasingly worry of its fragility. The imagined possibility of creating a new habitat, another world that we can live for the human community on an unknown planet by massive immigration, has lost much of its persuasive power. It had tremendous persuasive power in the early part of the 20th century, but it's lost its persuasive power since the 60s. Even the message in science fiction is how to live the good life as earthlings. Even if we travel distant, very far, the rules and regulations and moral code that we eventually have to subscribe to turn out to be our own, the one that we understand, which is predicated on our embeddedness in the earth here and now. The practical difficulty of developing alternative sources of energy and the virtual impossibility of inventing radically different forms of life. Now, when Wittgenstein, the great philosopher, used the word forms of life or form of life, he probably didn't refer to different culture had different forms of life. He only referred to the form of life that we've lived as human beings for millennia. There's only one form. Of course, this makes us realize how unique is our life on Earth. As the horizon of our knowledge extends, we learn, of course, there are limits to the speed and quantity of our economic growth, that the natural sources are exhaustible, and of course, the deterioration of the environment has has all kinds of grave consequences for the human community as a whole. And of course, the biologists have told us the loss of genes, species, and ecosystems is endangering the equilibrium of a life support system. And many scholars in cultural studies, in linguistics, have warned us that even the loss of languages, or many different languages, the loss of linguistic diversity will eventually impoverish our human form of life. Each language, whether it's nativistic, foreign, is a cumulative effort of large group of human beings trying to understand their world. Let's say when I was in India, we learned that Sanskrit is one of the most complicated languages in the world and rich with all kinds of symbolic resources. But I asked great Sanskritists to give me a description of snow, and very few Sanskritists were able to do that, because in subtropical area, it's extremely difficult to experience snow, whereas the Eskimo language, which may not as sophisticated as Sanskrit, has numerous words, 6 different words describing snow, whereas English, that's only one. So if that language is destroyed, some kind of diversity is lost, the human experience as a whole is also impoverished. The painful acknowledgement that what we have been doing to nature and to our global community, of course to ourselves, in the last 2 centuries, since the French Revolution, especially in the last 4 decades, since the end of the Second World War, has resulted in a course of self-destruction that has, of course, instilled a tremendous sense of urgency. The necessity of a basic reorientation of our thought with a view toward a fundamental restructuring of our lifestyle is glaringly clear. And yet the dominant ideology that has informed the human community as a whole, and still considered by me as perhaps the most powerful, is the Enlightenment mentality. This university will not be able to survive without that mentality. This mentality underlies the modern West as the most dynamic and transformative ideology in human history. Virtually all major spheres of interest, areas of study, characteristic of the modern age, are indebted to or intertwined with this particular mentality. Science and technology, just to name a few, industrial capitalism, market economy, democratic polity, mass communication, research universities, civil and military bureaucracies, and of course, all kinds of professional organizations. Furthermore, this is critical for our purpose. The values we cherish, when I use the word we, I use it genetically east and west, north and south, a modern person, right? As definitions, the values that we cherish as definitions of modern consciousness, including liberty, equality, human rights, the dignity of the individual, respect for privacy, government for, by, and of the people, and due process of law, are all historically, and some would say structurally, inseparable from the Enlightenment mentality. So we can say we've flourished in the sphere of interests and their attendant values occasioned by the advent of the modern West, ever since the Enlightenment of the 18th century. We can even say that they make these values and these spheres of interest make our life world, the world we live in, operative and meaningful. We are so seasoned in this particular mentality, I call it Enlightenment mentality, that we assume the reasonableness of its general ideological thrust. It's reasonable to be enlightened. The Enlightenment faith in progress, reason, and individualism may have lost some of its persuasive power in the modern West. Let's say in Cambridge or Berkeley or Palo Alto. But these remain the standards of inspiration for intellectual and spiritual leaders throughout the world. Now, it is inconceivable that any modern project, including those in ecological sciences, those in environmental studies and so forth, does not subscribe to the thesis that the human condition is improvable, that it is desirable to find rational means to solve world's problems, and that the dignity of the person as an individual ought to be respected. So we can say enlightenment is a form of human awakening, as a discovery of the human potential for self and communal transformation. And of course, as the desire of the human person to become the measure and master of all things. This is still the most powerful, not only ideological, but moral discourse in the political culture of the modern age. For many decades, it has become the unquestioned assumption of the ruling minorities and cultural elites of developing countries as well as highly industrialized societies. But a fair understanding, I underscore the importance of fairness here, a fair understanding, a sophisticated, a nuanced understanding of this mentality requires a frank discussion of the dark side of the modern West. Most of us are quite familiar with imperialism, colonialism, and exploitation. But what one of our colleagues, David Landers, has described as the unbound Prometheus, you know, the myth of Prometheus. It's unbound. The Prometheus is able to do all kinds of things without the constraint of cosmic forces, which symbolizes the runaway technology of development. It may have been a spectacular achievement in the early phases of industrial development, but in recent decades, it has also led to disastrous consequences for the environment as a whole. This tremendous energy, drive, you can say, not only to know to explore, but also to conquer, to subdue, still is the most powerful ideology of the modern West. Of course, if we look at it, especially in taking into consideration of the dark side, the age, the Enlightenment is called the age of reason. But many features that we experience since the Enlightenment are totally incongruous with the image of the age of reason. In the context of this particular discourse, progress sometimes degenerates into inequality. Reason becomes self-interest, and individualism reveals itself as greed. Now, just take an example, which is very common to us, but in comparative civilizational perspective, it's very important. The typical American dream of owning a car and a house, earning a fair wage, and enjoying freedom of privacy, expression, religion, and travel, is very reasonable to our sense of what ordinary life entails. Unfortunately, it's lamentably unexportable as a modern demand from the global perspective. For years and years, we knew it couldn't be exported to South Asia, Africa, and many parts of East Asia or the Middle East. Recently, we know it's not exportable to Europe, and increasingly, it may not be easily realizable at home. So an urgent task for the community of what may be called like-minded people, deeply concerned about these issues, ecological issues, but also communal issues, especially the disintegration of communities at all levels, to assure that both the ruling minorities and cultural elites in the modern West actively participate in a kind of spiritual joint venture to rethink the Enlightenment heritage. I'm not saying abandonment. Many postmodernists would consider abandonment of the whole Enlightenment project is necessary. I'm not arguing that case at all. The paradox, as I see it, is that we cannot afford to uncritically accept its inner logic in light of many of the unintended consequences. Originally, it didn't intend to develop this, but these unintended consequences for the life support system, for our community, for the survivability of the human species. Because of these unintended consequences, we cannot uncritically accept it, nor can we reject its relevance with all of its fruitful ambiguities to our intellectual and our own spiritual self-definition. In other words, we are all children of the Enlightenment. We cannot reject it as irrelevant to what we do here and now, and yet we know it's a mixed blessing. There are many negative consequences involved. We need to rethink it. And I think this course in the moral reasoning is an attempt, many attempts, there's one of those attempts to help us to rethink. A key to the success of this approach is to recognize particularly the conspicuous absence of the idea of community in the community in the whole Enlightenment project. In the three cardinal virtues of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, which means community. Liberty and equality are sometimes in conflict, and yet they're part of our political vocabulary. We talked about it. Liberty features most prominently in the capitalistic societies, and equality became a rhetoric of anti-capitalism among many of the socialist countries. But either capitalism or socialism can be considered as an integral part of this Enlightenment mentality. But fraternity or community as a concept drop out of the picture. Only in recent decades, political scientists became aware of the fact that in their profession, community has never featured prominently. The political scientists are not involved in the study of family, for example. They allow the sociologists, the anthropologists to worry about it. They are mainly concerned with the relationship of the individual and the state. So community at all levels is being relegated to the background. I suggest, in order to rethink this particular notion, we have to reorient our ethical ideas as well. Two basic principles, we'll get a chance to discuss them. Two basic principles will have to be evoked. The first one is the golden rule stated in the negative. Do not do unto others what you would not want others to do unto you. In fact, a whole lecture will be devoted to this particular issue, why the golden rule has to be stated in the negative rather than do unto others what you will want others to do unto you. Since the golden rule is stated in the negative, it will have to be augmented, supported by a positive principle. The positive principle is, in order to establish myself, I have to help others to establish themselves. In order to enlarge myself, I must help others to enlarge themselves. It is an inclusive sense of community based on a critical self-awareness, which is also communal, that the idea of the person as a central relationships necessarily involves the other people. In ethical sense, unlike the economic distribution of goods or the political distribution of power, communication enhances both parties. It's not a zero-sum game at all. There are many, many zero-sum games we are inevitably subscribed into. But the ethical religious orientation is to open up new possibilities where both parties will win through negotiation and through discussion. The mobilization of at least three kinds of spiritual resources is necessary to ensure this rethinking of the Enlightenment is going to be cast in a very broad context. The first involves the ethical religious traditions of the modern West, notably Greek philosophy, Judaism, and Christianity, many other traditions as well. The very fact that they have been instrumental in giving birth to the Enlightenment mentality, they all contributed in some way, makes a comparing case that they re-examined their relationships. What is the Christian relationship to the modern transformation of the world based upon the Enlightenment? What is the Judaic relationship? What is the Greek relationship? The exclusive, in the modern sense, the exclusive dichotomy, I mean dividing everything into two unrelated parts, matter, spirit, body, mind, the sacred, profane, man, nature, creator, creature, must be transcended to allow other values. The other values also enter into the pictures. What are some of these other values? The sanctity of the earth. Earth is not just materiality out there. The idea that we're interconnected with many other beings, I call it the continuity of beings. Our human being with other animal beings, with plants, with trees, and with the ecosystem, all interconnected, rather than the idea that we are cut off and have certain kind of power over the others. The beneficiary interaction or the necessary interaction between the human community and nature. The mutuality between human beings as earthlings and the broad idea of heaven or in the Christian sense of God, or Greek sense of logos. The Greek emphasis on rationality, the biblical image of man, have dominion over the earth, and even the Protestant work ethic, which has contributed to the dynamism of the modern West. All these are relevant as background. The unintended, as I mentioned earlier, the unintended consequences of the rise of the modern West made us particularly sensitive to the rich spiritual resources of the West. And we have to understand how these resources can be mobilized for helping us to think through the Enlightenment. The second kind of spiritual resources are derived from non-Western but major religious traditions, including Hinduism, Buddhism in South and Southeast Asia, Confucianism and Taoism in East Asia, and of course, Islam. Islam often should be considered as an integral part of the West because Islam had contributed to the Renaissance, therefore by implication to the Enlightenment. And yet, in recent decades, we often characterize Islam as the radical otherness. Only people in the Middle East, people in Asia, embrace Islam. We didn't know that Islam, in fact, is the fastest growing religion in America today. Now it's probably the second largest religion. If you put all the Christian traditions into one religion, and Islam is the second largest, Judaism is the third largest, and many other religious traditions. Industrial East Asia, we'll have a chance to talk about it next Thursday. Under the influence of Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist cultures, has already developed a less adversarial, meaning conflictual, a less individualistic, and a less self-interested modern civilization. We see the coexistence of market economy with government leadership, democratic polity with meritocracy, examination system to recruit the best minds to the government, and individual initiatives with group orientation. So what we see in East Asia is a different form of modernity, deeply under the influence of the West, and yet somewhat different. Unfortunately, since East Asia has been humiliated and frustrated by the imperialist and colonial domination of the modern West for more than a century, the rise of East Asia symbolizes some of the Western values of competitiveness, of control, of commercialism developing at a vengeance. The mentality of Japan and the so-called four mini dragons, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, is characterized by mercantilism, commercialism, and international competitiveness. These are not societies that exhibit Confucian values alone. Often Confucian values have been instrumentalized, used to enhance their competitiveness. So the possibility of developing, for these societies to developing a more humane and sustainable economy should not be exaggerated. And yet, we should always regard these societies as reference points or reference societies for understanding our own situation here and now. The third kind I just mentioned in passing is the spiritual resources involve the primal traditions or indigenous traditions, Native American, Hawaiian, Maori, and of course numerous other indigenous religious traditions. We can even include Japanese Shintoism in this context. They've demonstrated with physical strength and even aesthetic elegance, that a human life has been sustainable since the Neolithic age. One particular way of life can be pursued indefinitely. The primordial traditions have never endangered their own environment. There's always an interplay between their lived world and the world around. It's a different kind of human flourishing. But it is not simply imagined. It is realized, and it has developed. Of course, I'm not proposing a kind of romantic attachment to this particular form of life. But I'm critically aware of the claim that one thing we can all learn from the primal traditions is a sense of rootedness in a particular environment. Rootedness in the sense of being embedded in a particular environment. If we look at the situation of the world today, we realize that two very powerful currents of thought emerging. They are contradictory to each other, and both of them are extremely powerful. One is globalization. The other one is localization. Localization in the sense of the search for roots. I mentioned in passing last time, when we say the search for roots, I have in mind specifically race, language, gender, homeland, class, and religion. If we look at the Enlightenment project, the idea is the world will eventually be homogenized, will be transformed into a world defined in terms of market economy, democratic polity, and individualism. All the cultural differences will be undermined. But in the last 30 or 40 years, we realize that not just in developing societies, but in highly industrialized societies, the search for roots turned out to be very powerful in shaping our life world. In the United States, one of the most difficult issues concerning the integration of the American society is the question of race. Ethnic conflict is one of the most serious problems. In Canada and Belgium, language may turn out to be so powerful it could split the society into fragmented communities. The question of gender is such that our workplace, our sense of human relationships, our interpersonal definitions, every aspect of our experience have been reshaped because of feminist awareness and the importance of gender. The question of homeland often is linked to the struggles of the Palestinians. But there is also Hawaiian spirituality. There's also the question of the Basque in Spain and in France. There's a question of Taiwan independent movement, the question of freeing Tibet. So these questions of rootedness in one's own land, what is one's hometown, continue to be significant for understanding the world in which we live. The question of class now is linked to the question of wealth and power on the one hand and poverty on the other, what we call the North and South problem. We normally associate North and South problem in terms of two major regions in the world. Now, in every country, in every city, we have the North and South problem. We used to worry about the question of inter-religious conflict between two different religious traditions, the Muslim community and the Jewish community, for example. Recently, we also worry about intra-religious conflict. The radical Jews on the one hand and the modest and conservative ones on the other. The evangelical Christians and the liberal Christians. The more militant Buddhists and the more conservative Buddhists. Within the Confucian tradition, the people who want to transform the society according to the new vision, and the people who want to commit to the old pattern. These conflicts within the same religious tradition become critical. My suggestion here is that we want to move away from any form of exclusivism, claiming that our own religious tradition, our own faith, has the best message to deliver, therefore not open to other possibilities. I'm also suggesting it's not enough simply to be inclusive, in the sense that I would like to learn from many other religious traditions, but eventually learning from other religious traditions simply to enrich my own. What we see in the world today is that the ethic which is best for me may not necessarily best for my neighbor. And I have to understand different points of view in reference to what I cherish to be most powerful and most significant. But when we celebrate cultural diversity, it is important that we do not fall into the trap of a form of relativism. In other words, everything goes. You don't have any standards, don't have any judgment. It is in this sense, I think, we need to cherish the importance of the dialogical mode, that is, the communication. If you've never encountered the people you respect, but with radically different belief systems, with radically different value orientations, your understanding of yourself and the world is quite confined to a particular mode of thinking. In fact, most of us are very much confined in the values of the modern West, with emphasis on market economy, democratic polity, and individualism. How do we move beyond some of the constraints of the society and try to raise critical questions, not only about the world, but also about ourselves? Now, one reason that we need to involve ourselves in this kind of discourse is because we become increasingly aware of the vulnerability of the human condition itself. Whether human beings can be a viable species is already questionable. With this concern, which none of the major religious traditions ever encountered before, the new situation that the human community has encountered, none of the religious traditions ever even speculated the questions that we face today. In that sense, we need to mobilize virtually all the spiritual resources in the global community that will be able to help us. And in so doing, we have to have an open-minded attitude. And that open-minded attitude is to allow many different paths to coexist. Almost like the idea of mountain climbing. When we begin the journey, we know that it's best for me is where I stand. I look up. I know a particular path, which is the best for me. But as I ascend and turn around, I realize there are many, many different paths that eventually could lead the same point where I manage to come up. When I move much higher, my horizon becomes much greater extended. I can see many other possibilities. When I get to the top of the mountain, I can see that people can come up to this point from many different dimensions. Even the other side of the mountain I never imagined possible. Now, the standards of excellence and the possibility of many different paths that lead to the same point are not at all incompatible. While we celebrate cultural diversity, we are deeply concerned about what I call the pernicious relativism which has turned our imagined global community into the nightmare of fragmented village, replete with difference, differentiation, dissonance, and even outright discrimination. So we can have a very pluralistic view of the world, allowing many ways, and without losing sight of the standards of excellence, at the same time, open up to many other possibilities. This is the background for us to try to think through the Enlightenment and try to think what kind of ethical orientation is absolutely necessary for all members of the human community to subscribe to. Let me suggest two ways in conclusion. One way of looking for this kind of global ethic is to find the lowest common denominator. The so-called lowest common denominator is that which is so evidently true that nobody will question. Unfortunately, the lowest common denominator, even though it's true, like saying everybody is a rational human being, it is not particularly inspiring. It is not particularly stimulating because it is the minimum condition for human survival. Not to kill anyone, not to murder anyone, not to cheat, not to do the things that we normally would not do anyway. To find the minimum condition is one way of doing it. The other approach is to understand a concrete person, a living concrete person, in terms of all the complexities, all the concrete unique features that a person embodies, and try to reach a deeper level of self-understanding as a basis for communication. The image is not constructing an imagined global ethic. The image is digging a well. You dig deeply into the ground of your own existence. Understand yourself in the concrete particularity that you experience as a concrete living human being. But if you don't dig deep enough, you bury yourself in the hole. You need to dig deep enough to link yourself to other possibilities. And that digging, if it reaches the common spring of humanity, it will float outward. You do not lose a sense of your particularity. You allow all the other people to have their particularities, and you dig deep enough in order to reach them, not abstracting yourself from the concrete to become simply an abstract idea. And this process is painfully difficult. And this process is a process that requires dialogue, requires our respect of the various kinds of spiritual resources in the world today, and require that we have a critical understanding of the most powerful ideology, the so-called universalizable ideology of the modern West, and look at it critically and reflectively. The Confucian dictum that what we do in the privacy of our home, in our family life, in our private domain, is politically significant and even cosmologically meaningful, ought to be taken seriously. And the Confucian idea that self-cultivation is not only anthropologically necessary, meaning necessary for human beings, but spiritually meaningful. Not only meaningful for us, but meaningful for the cosmos, must be fully appreciated in our attempt to locate the transforming agency of this global ethic in all the constitutive elements of the world. I mean, all kinds of communities, from the individual to the family, to society, to the state, and also to the world at large. Thank you.